Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 14 in our continuing study of this book. We've been going through Proverbs. We're in that section, chapters 10 through 24, the one verse maxims, and specifically coming to chapter 14, we're in that first section of that, the righteous versus the wicked. We still are coming up to the living the righteous life. That'll be in the next few chapters. And then after that, words of the wise. That'll take us through all of these Proverbs of Solomon. And then we still have more Proverbs left over. Chapter 14 and verse 1, the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish tears it down with her own hands. Now, sometimes it's asked, well, aren't there proverbs for women? And this sounds like it could be one. Although remember that the proverbs are primarily proverbs, they're advice to a young man. We said that earlier in the book of Proverbs. And given that that has been our background, we could say that this young man ought to choose the right kind of wife. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody who's older cannot read and benefit from the Proverbs, or that a woman cannot read and benefit. I'm an old guy, and yet I can find great benefit here in these books, even though it's not written specifically to me, to an old fellow, or necessarily to a woman. Yet we can learn some lessons. We can still apply it to ourselves. Verse 2, he who walks in his uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is devious in his ways despises him. You can see where that sort of proverb would apply to anybody, whether you walk upright or whether you're devious in your ways. Notice how that contrasts, that actually connects with how you relate to the Lord. Verse 3, in the mouth of the foolish is a rod for his back. Think of the imagery there. But the lips, so you've got the mouth of the foolish, the lips of the wise will protect them. There's a speaking reference here, things that you say. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. I want you to, we're going to go through it and then see a bigger pattern. Verse 4, where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much revenue comes by the strength of the ox. Now, think about what this is saying. If you want to have a clean manger, a clean stable, then just get rid of your oxen. Of course, you're not going to benefit from the oxen if you get rid of them. Reminds me of a time when we were looking at security at the Bible college where I teach, and folks that really had that as their prime duty. They were really looking hard and ways that we could improve security, and that's not a bad thing. But it got to the point where I said, I know a way to improve security at the school. If we just not let anybody in, we'll be perfectly secure. But that's not what we're here for. We're actually here for students, and we need to bring people in from the outside. The same idea is here. And so the point is that actually think about this, how this relates to ministry in the church. Ministry can be messy. But the reverse of that is if there's no ministry, yes, you might not have the messiness, but then you're not going to be doing that which you're there for. And that's the point that's being made. Verse 5, a trustworthy witness will not lie, but a false witness utters lies. Very basic here. Notice we're back to things you say. Then in verses 6 and 7, a scoffer seeks wisdom and finds none, but knowledge is easy to one who has understanding. Think about that. Sometimes the scoffer, now think of, again, things you say, that's left over a little bit. He's scoffing and he might be looking for wisdom, but it just seems out of reach. It seems it's impossible for him to attain. But to the one who has understanding, he gets more knowledge. There's something about scoffing that cuts you off from wisdom, and there's something about having understanding that gives you even more understanding, more knowledge. Verse 7, leave the presence of a fool, or you will not discern words of knowledge. Now, it looks at first glance like verses 6 and 7 are unrelated, but if you look for the point, go back and look at the scoffer, and then the one who has understanding, and then read about leaving the presence of a fool, or you will not discern words of knowledge. Remember, knowledge is easy to one who has understanding, words of knowledge. When you put these together, there's a point made. Choose the right kind of friends. Don't choose the scoffer as a friend. Don't be influenced by that. Be influenced by the person that does have understanding. And so those with whom you associate have a tendency to affect you. Now, ch- Notice how we started off by asking the question of the wife, choose the right kind of friends. Also, choose the right kind of wife. So we have in the section, notice we started off with choose the right kind of wife, and we end up in verse 7, choose the right kind of friends. And the way we got there, notice things you say, that was in verse 3, and again in verse 5. And the pivotal point was the wise use of resources, speaking about oxen, that was our example. And so we've been on a journey that talks about how we find that road to wisdom in who we're around, in what you say, in what you utilize, in how you sometimes endure the messiness of it all, the messiness of the journey. Now, verse 8 then, we're going to see a chiasm here as well. That was sort of a chiastic pattern. We're going to start in verse 8 with the sensible versus the fool. I'm going to look at it first, then we'll go through verse by verse. In verse 9, the results of sin. In verse 10, the secrets of the heart. In verse 11, the destruction of the wicked. And that's going to be actually those two verses, verses 11 and 12, will be our pivotal point. The way of death, which actually destruction and death are going to sort of go together. And then again, we'll see secrets of the heart again in verse 13. Again, we'll see results of sin, verse 14. And then finally, we'll come back again to the sensible versus the fool in verse 15. So verses 8 through 15 are something of a unit. Notice, by the way, so far, everything we've seen and everything we're going to see in here has been contrasting, sort of a contrastive parallel, this but that. But that's going to, we're going to have two exceptions. One is verse 10, the secrets of the heart. That's going to be synthetic parallelism. And again, the secrets of the heart in verse 13 is going to be another example of synthetic parallelism. Most of what we've seen in this entire section from chapter 10 all the way through this chapter and on into the next are mostly uh, parallels of contrast, contrasting parallelism. So let's jump in. We begin with that same kind of contrasting parallelism. You always see it in our English translation with the word but. The wisdom of the sensible is to understand his way. But the foolishness of fools, now notice how, there's sort of a double wisdom of the sensible, the wisdom of the wise, we could say almost, and then the foolishness of fools is deceit. Verse 9, fools mock at sin, but among the upright there is goodwill. So that notice the way of wrong, the way of right. Verse 10, here is our first synthetic parallel. The heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. So it's not really contrasting, it's actually finishing the thought. We're going to see it again in that parallel section a bit later. But then verse 11, the house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. So we have, sort of a journey in this section, wisdom and foolishness, sin, goodwill, a little bit about the heart in finding these things. But then again, that which brings destruction, the wicked and the upright is going to flourish. Now, the reverse parallel, we're saying sort of the same thing, but in reverse order. Verse 12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but this is back to the contrast, but its end is the way of death. There's a way that looks like it can get me where I need to go. But sometimes a way that looks like it can get me where I think I need to go might actually be a bad way. And that's the point that's being made here. The end is the way of death. Verse 13, even in laughter, the heart may be in pain. And the end of joy, notice the heart, it might be in pain. The end of joy may be grief. Notice pain and grief, laughter, joy. And there's no parallel to the heart. It's just talking about the end of where it all takes me. But notice how that synthetic parallelism. That is, it's finishing the thought of where I had been going. Verse 14: the backslider in heart will have his fill of his own ways, but a good man, that's the contrast, will be satisfied with his. So when you know to do right and then you go ahead and do it, that's good. That's what you want to be doing. Not to be starting that way and then turning off to a different way. Verse 15, the naive believes everything. Let me just say, naivety can be dangerous. Gullibility That's what's in view here. Gullibility can be dangerous. The naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his steps. He checks out. I can think of this. Let me just use a firefighter illustration. Um, one of my close friends in the firehouse was actually, he had stopped by a barge, and I used to work as a firefighter on a port, shipping port, and sometimes we'd have to go on board both vessels and ships and barges. And he was just checking out the situation there on a barge, but it was late at night and it wasn't well lit. And he wasn't really watching the deck because it was shrouded in shadow, and didn't notice that one of the deck plates had actually been removed. And he stepped forward onto what he thought was solid deck, and instead his leg went down, and there was a jagged piece that cut it wide open from sort of stem to stern, really a nasty cut. Now that's a physical illustration, but let's apply that to here. The naive thinks he can just walk right aboard and everything's okay. Doesn't watch where he's going. He doesn't check things out. But the sensible man considers his steps, not just on board a barge at night, but in life he checks out his steps. Now, you see that verse 15, the naive believes everything, the sensible man considers his steps. That's going to introduce the next section. So let's go there. Where I just put it up here again. So we're just moving now to the next section, verse 16. A wise man, as opposed to the naive, a wise man is cautious and turns away from evil. But a fool is arrogant and careless. And like my friend in the physical realm, he was a pretty smart guy, but in the physical realm, he had a misstep. And that can happen in other areas of life too. Such as, verse 17, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly. You see, sometimes you can walk and you get angry very quickly, and then you find yourself doing. Let me just say, sometimes your temper can cause your brain to disconnect, and a man of evil devices is hated. Verse 18, the naive, that's how we started. Remember, the naive believes everything. We're back to the naive again. Verse 18, the naive inherit foolishness, but the sensible, we're back to the naive and the sensible are crowned with knowledge. So we started with that naive and sensible, and we come full circle back to the same descriptions. Next, by the way, what we see here is wise living. Now we want to continue. The evil will bow down before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. Notice there's an honor and shame thing going on here. There's a right and wrong, but there's also, I'm not sure if I say that it's a conflict, but maybe there is. The evil and the conflict oftentimes are. The evil and the good are oftentimes in conflict. And when it talks about, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous, that remember the gates, that was sort of the public assembly. That was where you decided matters. That's where the judge and even the king would be. Verse 20, the poor is hated by his neighbor, but those, and notice, hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many. Now, that's not saying it ought to be that way. That's just wisdom saying, be aware that sometimes these things can take place. Uh, have you noticed when somebody comes into a fortune, wins the lottery or something like that, suddenly, suddenly they have all sorts of friends. And when somebody goes bankrupt, away go their friends. And that's the point that's being made. It's not saying that's the way it should happen. It's just pointing out the reality of real life. Verse 21, he who despises his neighbor. Now, we just said that the poor is hated even by his neighbor. So connect that with this. He who despises his neighbor sins. It's not saying you ought to do that you ought to hate the poor, you ought to despise your neighbor. But happy is he who is gracious to the poor. You see how verses 20 and 21 actually go together. Verse 20 talks about what is, and then verse 21 says what ought to be. Verse 22, will they not go astray who devise evil, but kindness and truth will be to those who devise good. And so we have the theme here dealing with neighbors. And each one of these is how to get along with those around you, your neighbors. Verse 23, in all labor there is profit. But mere talk leads only to poverty. You can talk about how to get rich, but sometimes you just need to work. If working, let me just say, working works, and talk doesn't necessarily. I'm not saying all talking is bad, but if you're only talking about working and not actually working, you're missing something. Verse 24, the crown of the wise is their riches. Notice the profit, poverty, riches theme, but the folly of foolish is foolishness. So notice there's a rags to riches theme. How to go from rags to riches, and I suppose also how to go from riches to rags. It's possible to do the reverse. Verse 25, a truthful witness saves lives, but he who utters lies is treacherous. Truth telling is a good thing. In fact, I like the way Paul says it in Ephesians chapter 4, that we are to be truthful people. We're actually to be, he uses the term, they don't translate it this way. He says truthing in love, and I like that, speaking the truth in love. But the Greek actually says truthing in love, and I like that. Verse 26, in the fear of the Lord, there is strong confidence, and his children will have refuge. And then we have again the fear of the Lord. It's in verse 26, again in verse 27. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may avoid the snares of death. And finally, verse 28, in a multitude of people is a king's glory, but in the dearth of people is a prince's ruins. Remember how he said that ministry can be messy, and oxen, and when the manger is messy, the oxen are well fed. There's something about that here in verse 28. Um, Kings aren't much good if there's nobody to be king over, if there's no people there, if there's no nation. But in the dearth of people is a prince's ruins. Leaders have to have people to lead, or else a leader without people that he's leading is just a guy going for a walk. So the theme here is life and death. Verse 29, he who is slow to anger has great understanding. Now notice it doesn't say never to be angry. There are times when frankly I think we should be angry, but more often we shouldn't be. And so notice he who is slow to anger has great understanding, and the contrast, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. Being quick-tempered can just get you into all sorts of trouble. And so we have a temper theme that continues into the next verse. A tranquil heart is life to the body, but passion, and I have to deal with a Hebrew here, says passion is rottenness to the bones. I'm gonna contest that translation. The Hebrew term kinah, the Legacy Standard Bible renders it jealousy. The King James, the NIV, the ESV all agree, rendering it envy. And I think either one of those will work, because jealousy and envy are just two different ways of saying the same thing. Now, let me say that jealousy, usually we hear that word by itself, and that's always a bad thing. And it can be a bad thing, it can be a good thing. It's okay to envy something that's positive. If I see someone being spiritual and I see their relationship with God, I had to envy that in a good sense. I had to say, not that I don't want them to have it, but I'd like to have that relationship with the Lord too. Um, this is the same term that talks about the zeal of the Lord. Um, God is jealous for his people and for the honor of his temple. Remember how Jesus went in when they were dishonoring God's temple. He got a scourge together, and he made a mess of things, in a good way, because he was zealous, he was jealous, he was envious of God's honor. And that's the term that's used here, but here I think it is used in a negative sense. So I would take out passion, and I'd put either jealousy or envy as that which is rottenness to the bones, when it's used in a bad sense, like we were saying, and as it is, I think, here. Verse 31, he who oppresses the poor taunts his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy, notice how poor and needy is just saying the same thing, oppression versus, and this is a study in contrast. So there's the one who oppresses the poor. You say, well, I don't oppress the poor. Well, maybe not directly. Do you do so indirectly? And I think that's a pressing question, and a question that we in the West need to ask ourselves. And I'm not sure always what to do about that. But certainly I think we ought to at least be cognizant, we who live in a very wealthy culture. But he who is gracious to the needy, and I think that's the answer, that we are called to be gracious to the needy. And let me just say, there are times where I've done that, and times where I look in shame and say, I'm not sure that I was. I was maybe a little suspicious, and thinking I was going to be taken advantage of. And I think we ought to be gracious to the needy. And let me just preach that to myself. I think I had to be more gracious to the needy. And we're called to do that. We continue verse 32. The wicked is thrust down by his wrongdoing, but the righteous has a refuge when he dies. So wickedness versus righteousness. And then verse 33, wisdom rests in the heart of one who has understanding. But and the term heart there is our typical word for heart, lev. And the only reason I mention it here is because we're going to see a different word that's unfortunately been translated heart as well in the last line. But in the hearts of fools, and here are the terms, different term, karev, uh, speaks of sort of the inward part. I think of the time when Sarah hears something, it's wife of Abraham, and she sort of laughs within her in her inner part. Has the same idea. It's a synonym for heart, but it's a different word. Remember, we do that a lot in Hebrew parallelism. Sometimes you'll repeat the same word, and we've noted that happening, but sometimes you'll use a synonym, and that's part of the poetry. So wisdom rests in the heart of one who has understanding, but in the inward part, can I render that of fools? What's the it? Well, that's the wisdom. Actually, if I wanted to be literal, I would say wisdom rests in the heart of the one who has understanding, but in the inner part of fools, she. Remember how I said in an earlier class that wisdom is feminine? That's just the way the word is. She is made known. And speaking of wisdom, and remember, all words in Hebrew are either masculine or feminine. There is no it in Hebrew, but there is in English. So our translators really haven't done us a disservice. They're just trying to make it understanding. If they had put she, I think a lot of people would scratch their heads and say, "What on earth is that talking about?" Now, the Legacy Standard Version takes this, and I couldn't help it. Whenever I see something, I think I would have translated it differently. I look at that Legacy Standard Version that came out just a year or two ago. I've really been admiring it. And it says, wisdom rests in the heart of the one who has understanding. It's word for word the same. But in the midst of fools, notice in the inward part, but they're not talking about just the inner part of the fool, but in his midst, among him. And that might be the idea that I'm supposed to get. In the midst of fools is, and notice they added the word merely, but I think they're trying to make a point of that there's a difference between when it's the heart of one who has understanding, but in the midst of fools, it's merely made known. In other words, the fool, the group of fools, they can maybe see wisdom, but they don't connect with it, or let me put it this way, they don't apply it. And that's the danger. You see, it's possible to hear the Proverbs and to hear them, but not to apply. To have it even in your Bible study and circled in your Bible, but not to apply. May the Lord lead us in application. We finally sum up verse 34, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. So notice nation, people, if you haven't figured it out, there's a civic theme here. The king's favor is toward a servant who acts wisely, but his anger, his favor, first the king's favor, now the king's anger is toward him who acts shamefully. So we close with the city theme, and in closing, I want to point out that there's a city theme to the Bible. In fact, we read in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 14, for here we do not have a lasting city. Let me just say, I'm a city boy. I've lived all my life in cities and not out in the country. Um, for here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come. And so there's a civic theme, and we are called to remember our King, the King of righteousness.